Hi everybody, this is a piece titled The Program of Stalinist Imperialism by Max Shachtman. This is featured in The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, edited by Matgamna. It's under a section of the book titled Russian Imperialist Expansion. This is from the New International. There's a typo here. I don't actually. It says 194. I think there's supposed to be a number after it, but that's okay. It's probably though from the late 1940s. The last piece I read was from this section was from. Excuse me. Come on. It was from 1943. So it's probably after 1943. But maybe it's not. Maybe I'll look it up later. Let's actually see. If anything comes up when I search up the original title of this piece. It's from October 1943. Alright. So here we are. The program of Stalinist imperialism. The ruling class in Russia is the Stalinist bureaucracy. It is composed of the leaders of all economic and political, including military, life in the country. They are organized, led and controlled by the political machine of the bureaucracy, the so-called Communist Party. This bureaucracy came to power in one of the bloodiest counter-revolutions in history. To achieve its unchecked totalitarian mastery of the country, it not only wiped out all the great achievements of the socialist revolution of 1917, but physically exterminated a whole generation of revolutionists with a thoroughness and cold-blooded cynicism unmatched by any reactionary power in the world, and reduced both worker and peasant to a new kind of state serf. This bureaucracy came to power under exceptionally favorable circumstances. Its domain was 1/6 of the world's surface, endowed with tremendous, barely exploited resources and a population greater than that of any modern power. It was able to introduce the sympathy of toilers throughout the world by adopting some of the outward trappings of the great working class revolution of the Bolsheviks, which it was itself destroying. Its consolidation was favored by the fact that the surrounding capitalist world was gripped for years by the most paralyzing economic crisis in history, and by the fact that there was relative peace in the world. The causes and circumstances of the rise of this new class have been detailed by us elsewhere. Here it is enough to point out that the Stalinist bureaucracy came to power not only by overturning the power of the proletariat and reducing that class to its subject, but also by just as ruthlessly crushing the elements of capitalism in Russia and the classes representing capitalism in Russia. Under Stalin, forced labor went hand in hand with the, quote, extermination of the kulak as a class, end quote, and the wiping out of the NEP and the Netmen. This point is of special importance in understanding the Stalinist policy in and after the war. The collectivist bureaucracy does not tolerate sharing power with capitalism, to say nothing of the working class, wherever it has the strength to take power exclusively for itself. Wherever it has the strength to take power exclusively for itself. What is the economic basis of the Russian bureaucracy's power? The state-owned, state-centralized, state-managed, state-exploited property which belongs to the Russian bureaucracy collectively and to it alone. From it, it derives its strength, its power, its privilege, its rule. Unless faced with a superior force, and none has yet presented itself, it would not divide this power with any other class, be it capitalist or proletarian. To defend its rule and privilege, it must defend the economic basis upon which it rests and repel all social forces that covet it. Throughout her history, Russia has been defeated by one power after another because she was weak. The master of platitudes and the bureaucracy once said in a speech, "And that is why we must become strong." Quote, "To become strong," end quote, meant, for the bureaucracy as well as for any other modern class, to industrialize the country, to modernize the country, to, quote, "catch up with and outstrip the advanced countries." The bureaucracy proceeded to do just that, and, as the war has shown, on a titanic scale and with unexpected success. A socialist success? In no way. For the successes of Russian economy were accomplished at the drastic expense of the social position of the working class and to the benefit of its exploiters and rulers. At the same time, however, the successes were accomplished without benefit to the capitalistic elements or classes in Russia, but rather to the detriment, more simply, to the point of their destruction. The bureaucracy will not share its power with any class. The Stalinist bureaucracy, at least as well educated politically as the other ruling class of the world, understood all along that war is inevitable in the modern capitalist world. In order to strengthen itself, it required time, and if possible, a time of peace. Its foreign policy was therefore directed to postponing the outbreak of the war as long as possible, but also to make such alliances with sections of the capitalist world, or maintaining such divisions and antagonisms within that world, as would reduce the magnitude of a possible attack upon Russia, or, inasmuch as war must come sooner or later, to have it occur as an intercapitalist conflict. Hence, Stalin's famous, quote, pacifism, the Litvinoviad. One second. Gotta look some things up. Let's see if any of these things come up. According to Wikipedia, collective security is a multilateral security arrangement between states in which each state in the institution accepts that an attack on one state is the concern of all and merits a collective response to threats by all. Collective security was a key principle underpinning the League of Nations and the United Nations. Collective security is more ambitious than systems of alliance security or collective defense in that it seeks to encompass the totality of states within a region or indeed globally. The premise of a collective security arrangement is that it serves as a deterrent to aggression by committing an international coalition against any aggressor. While collective security is an idea with a long history, its implementation in practice has proved problematic. Collective security is also referred to by the phrase, "an attack on one is an attack on all." However, usage of this phrase also frequently refers to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the collective security provision in NATO's charter. I didn't see anything for Litvinoviad, but I think it refers to Litvinov. And Maxim Litvinov lived from 1876 to 1951, was a Russian revolutionary and prominent Soviet statesman and diplomat who served as People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs from 1930 to 1939. Litvinov was an advocate for diplomatic agreements leading to disarmament and was influential in making the Soviet Union a party to the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Litvinov was also responsible for the 1929 Litvinov Protocol, a multilateral agreement to implement the Kellogg-Briand Pact between the Soviet Union and several neighboring states. In 1930, Litvinov was appointed People's Commissar of Foreign Affairs, the highest diplomatic position in the USSR. During the 1930s, Litvinov advocated the official Soviet policy of collective security with Western powers against Nazi Germany. According to Wikipedia, The Litvinov Protocol is the common name for an international peace treaty concluded in Moscow on February 9, 1929. Named after the chief Soviet diplomat moving the negotiations forward, Maxim Litvinov, the treaty provided an immediate implementation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact by its signatories, thereby formally renouncing war as a part of national foreign policy. The formal name of the Litvinov Protocol, as registered with the League of Nations, was the, quote, Protocol for the immediate entry into force of the Treaty of Paris of August 27, 1928, regarding renunciation of war as an instrument of national policy. The treaty is also sometimes known as the Moscow Protocol. Initial signatories of the Litvinov Protocol included the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Soviet Union, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and Romania. 4 other countries were later formally adhered to the protocol: Lithuania, Finland, Turkey, and Persia. And Wikipedia says the Kellogg-Briand Pact, or Pact of Paris, officially the General Treaty for Renunciation of War as an Instrument of National Policy, is a 1928 international agreement on peace, in which signatory states promised not to use war to resolve, quote, disputes or conflicts of whatever nature or of whatever origin they may be, which may arise among them, end quote. The pact was signed by Germany, France, and the United States on the 27th of August 1928, and by most other states soon after. Sponsored by France and the U.S., the pact is named after its authors, United States Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg and French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand. The pact was concluded outside the League of Nations and remains in effect. A common criticism is that the Kellogg-Briand Pact did not live up to all its aims, but has arguably had some success. It was unable to prevent the Second World War, but was the basis for trial and execution of wartime German leaders in 1946. Furthermore, declared wars became very rare after 1945. It has been ridiculed for its moralism, legalism, and lack of influence on foreign policy. The pact has had no mechanism for enforcement, and many historians and political scientists see it as mostly irrelevant and ineffective. Nevertheless, the pact served as the legal basis for the concept of a crime against peace, for which the Nuremberg Tribunal and Tokyo Tribunal tried and executed the top leaders responsible for starting World War II. Similar provisions to those in the Kellogg-Briand Pact were later incorporated into the Charter of the United Nations and other treaties, which gave rise to a more activist American foreign policy which began with the signing of the pact. Alright, so back to the text. Sorry about that. Hence Stalin's famous quote, pacifism, the Litvinoviad, the collective security policy, coupled with less publicized attempts to ally Russia with one bloc of capitalist nations against another. This kind of quote, pacifism, however, is related to war as reactionary nationalism is related to expansion and conquest. It precedes it and prepares for it. The inevitable Second World War, as the rulers of the world, Stalin included, knew and know, would have for its aim the redivision of the world in favor of the victors. More clearly than any of the other powers, perhaps, the Stalinist bureaucracy understood that the war meant redrawing the map of Europe, of Asia, and all other continents. Hitler was a pacifist for years, in preparation for the war, a nationalist for years, in preparation for conquest. Similarly, though not identically, with American imperialism. Likewise, Russia. Russia? Russia expand? Is that possible? What about Stalin's theory of, quote, socialism in one country? And his protestations that he does not covet an inch of foreign soil, any more than he will yield an inch of his own. He did yield, and he did covet. Now he intends to yield nothing, and to acquire as much of what he covets as possible. To think of the Stalinist bureaucracy as guided strictly by some abstract formula, quote, socialism in one country, is itself the sheerest abstractionism. It does not sit down before a meticulously drawn map of the Soviet Union and say, quote, we go as far as these frontiers and not an inch further. Within them, we shall always sit tight, because our theory of socialism in one country will not let us go beyond them, end quote. The Russian bureaucracy is inhibited by nothing but superior force, not by theoretical considerations or any other abstractions. And it is a ruling class whose rapacity has few equals in the world. In none of the democratic capitalist countries, at least, is labor so intensely exploited as in Russia. In none of them are the rights of the masses so shamelessly ignored. In none of them is the disparity between the social position of the aristocracy and that of the masses so great. But it is not mere desire, quote, free will, that impels the bureaucracy to expand wherever its strength makes expansion possible. There is a stronger, more compelling force. No country in the world today, whatever its social character, can stand still and remain independent. At any rate, not for long. The present world tends more and more to be divided into a few of the advanced and powerful economic countries who enjoy independence, and the others that stagnate or retrogress economically and inevitably fall into economic and then political dependency upon the few. For a country, and the ruling class in it, to survive as an independent entity, in our time especially, requires an extension of its economic, and therefore its political, power. That holds for the capitalist countries. That holds for the Stalinist that holds for Stalinist Russia, which is not capitalist. That would hold for a working class republic, even if in a different sense. The idea that Russia can expand its economic power indefinitely within the frontiers of what was the Soviet Union on the 22nd of August 1939, and in disregard of the expansion of the big countries outside those frontiers, is a first-class illusion which is not, however, shared by the Stalinist bureaucracy. It understands the world situation, it realizes the problem, it knows better, even if some of its apologists do not. Living amidst 100 countries of more or less equal strength, which would themselves be living a static existence within their own respective frontiers, Stalinist Russia would, or at least might, also continue a static existence within its former frontiers. That is, it would continue to, quote, reproduce, end quote, itself or to expand only, quote, internally. But this is of course a fantasy of fantasies. In actuality, Russia, like all other countries, lives in a world partitioned by a declining number of great powers, each of which can survive only at the expense of the others. That is what, quote, expand or die means for the old capitalist powers like Germany, the United States, England, and Japan. Russia must keep pace with their expansion. In a physically limited world, this also means resist or confine their expansion. Otherwise, Russia would eventually be overwhelmed by one or another of the powers that had succeeded in becoming the single, or one of two, supergiants in the world. In other words, for all the social, not socialist, differences that mark her off from the capitalist world, Russia is nevertheless confronted with the same problem and driven by the same impulsion as every other country in the world. The important difference between country and country, other considerations like geographical position, for example, being equal, lies in comparative physical strength, backed of course by economic strength. Norway cannot dream of aspiring to the ambitions of Yugoslavia, or Italy to those of France, or France to those of Russia, or Russia to those of the United States. It may be, and has been said, it is not a fact, however, that Russia's occupation of broader countries is merely a defensive measure aimed at acquiring strategical outposts that would discourage or blunt attacks from aggressor nations. And is it not a fact that these border countries were not really sovereign in the first place, or that, in any case, their occupation for defense purposes by Russia saved their tenuous sovereignty from being overturned by aggressor nations? Is it better for Lithuania to be under Hitler's domination or Stalin's? Does Bessarabia really belong to Russia, not to Romania? Implicit in these questions are the arguments made by really innocent people, but above all by the Stalinists, by their apologists, by the liberals who trail them, and alas, by some, quote, Trotskyists. But the arguments are replete with confusion, chauvinism, cynicism, and downright mendacity. If it could be shown that the seizure of these territories brought freedom to the people of the occupied territories, and thereby advanced the cause of freedom in other subject or semi-subject countries, it will be the right and duty of every real socialist, and even of every consistent Democrat, to defend the action. But nobody in the world can show that. Let us take the case of Poland. The incorporation of Poland's eastern section into Russia reduced the inhabitants to slaves of the bureaucracy, or, as Trotsky put it with an incomprehensible modification, to quote, semi-slaves of Stalin. What is more, it was accomplished as a byproduct, or a joint product, of the reduction of Western Poland to, quote, full-fledged slaves of Hitler. The same holds true for the other seizures. The same will hold true for the other, quote, defensive conquests made by Russia in collaboration with its present imperialist allies. Given the above consideration, the second argument stands out in its hoary reactionary nakedness. The United States occupied the Philippines to, quote, protect them from Spain and continued to occupy them to, quote, protect them from Japan. Japan now occupies them to, quote, protect them from the United States. Similarly, England protects India from other aggressors and, just incidentally, exploits and oppresses the Indians. Germany's, quote, protectorate over Czechoslovakia and the rest of Europe is equally notorious and instructive. In every such case, the imperialist apologist will say, informally to be sure, quote, granted, we're not ideal overlords, but the others who would take over if we withdrew are so much worse, end quote. The more blatant imperialists say, quote, this is our mission. The language is classic, but we still believe that the Philippines belong to the Filipinos, who must have the right to rule themselves, and Bessarabia belongs to the Bessarabians, and not to a, quote, Russia, which actually means a counter-revolutionary bureaucracy. It is sometimes lamely argued by the more radical apologists, quote, but under Lenin too, Russia crossed borders, conquered territories, in the Far East, in Tanu Tuva, in Georgia, in Poland. Where is your internationalism? End quote. The similarity is only superficial. Under Lenin, the conquest of the Red Army brought freedom, or at least the beginnings of freedom, and extended the realm of socialism. Under the Stalinist bureaucracy, the conquest of the Russian army bring the end of all freedom for the working class. The difference, as Lenin used to say curtly, is enough for us. The third argument is also classic and no less mendacious. Washington on the Potomac has to be defended by occupying the Gulf of Panama under the first Roosevelt, and by occupying Iceland under the second Roosevelt. To defend London on the Thames, England established a world empire, each part of which was occupied to defend the part preceding it in the series. To defend Berlin, Hitler first took the Rhine, then the Danube, then Danzig, and found that he required for the defense of all of them Cairo on the Nile. If the defense of Leningrad on the Neva and Odessa on the Black Sea required a seizure of Kaunas and Niemen and Esc on the Pruth, why does not the defense of Kaunas require the occupation at least of Königsberg, if not Warsaw and the Vistula, and so on and so on? If, as Stalin said in his 1942 May 1st order of the day, quote, we want to free our brother Ukrainians, Moldavians, White Russians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, and Karelians from the insults to which they have been subjected by the German fascist beasts, end quote, why not, quote, free in the same way the other peoples who have been subject to insults no less gross? What is the criterion? The 1939 frontiers of the Soviet Union? But that would exempt at least the Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians from the blessed freedom. The frontiers of old Tsarist Russia? But that would mean a, quote, gay, prosperous, and happy, end quote, life, not only for the Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians, but also for the Poles and Manchurians, and a virtual protectorate over Serbia and Bulgaria. Quote, blood brotherhood, end quote. But the, quote, racial criterion would bring under Stalinist, quote, freedom, half the populations of Europe and Asia. Are the Poles and the Slovenes less racially akin to Great Russians than the Lithuanians, the Hungarians and Finns less than the Karelians, the Chinese and Tibetans less than the Kyrgyz and Buryats, and Turks and Iranians, and Afghans less than the Turkmen, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Beluchistanians? To mention the Volga Germans would be indelicate. The incorporation of any or all such countries and peoples into the USSR would be fitting, desirable, and greatly contributive to progress and freedom if it was a free union, if it was Soviet, if it was socialist, if it was a republic. But it is none of these. It is as much a republic as Germany. It is the land where socialists are most fiercely hounded in the world. The Soviets have been abolished in it. And the, quote, union is an empire of the great Russian bureaucrats who have deprived the people of the peripheral, quote, republics of their most elementary rights, including autonomy and self-rule. That the Russian ruling class wants the, quote, border countries for defense, is true, but not in the sense of its apologist. It aims to conquer and keep them for the defense and extension of the bases of its power, its privilege, its rule. It seeks their natural resources, their industrial plants and their populations, control, exploitation, and militarization of which would enhance its wealth, its powers, its restivity to attack, and the weight of its voice in world affairs. This should not be so hard to understand after the events of recent years. Naturally, there are limitations to the imperialist ambitions of the Stalinist bureaucracy, but these are not limitations set by some fundamental principle or an abstract theory or formula. They are determined concretely, at every given stage, by the relationship of forces, specifically by the relationship of forces between Russia and both its capitalist allies and opponents, on the one hand, and the relationship of forces between Russia and the working class and revolutionary socialist movements, on the other. This dual relationship expresses itself in an apparent duality of foreign policy. It is this duality that creates the dilemma in the mind of the bourgeois politicians and analysts as to just what Russian aims are. The famous enigma is revealed when the duality is analyzed, separated into its parts. In doing so, we get a clearer idea of the radical difference between the policy of Stalinist imperialism and the policy of capitalist imperialism. First part. Where the Stalinist bureaucracy does not dominate the working class and the labor movement, be it by persuasion or by violence, and where an attempt to overturn capitalism, we are assuming conditions when such an attempt is possible, would promptly bring reprisals against Russia by strong capitalist powers in a position to execute them, and especially where geographical remoteness makes the physical control of the country by Moscow extremely difficult. In such countries, the Russian bureaucracy works to prop up capitalist rule and to maintain a capitalist government. It prefers a democratic government so that its agents, above all the Communist Party, may be free to work and exert pressure in its behalf. A quote, strong, democratic government which will hold in check or suppress anti-Russian extremists from the right or working class and revolutionary anti-Stalinists from the left. In any case, the government must be friendly to Russia, if not outrightly pro-Russian. Thus, the Russian ruling class is interested in preserving capitalism only if a genuinely socialist revolution threatens. Against such a revolution, it always has and always will unite with the capitalist class. In this respect, as in all others, it shows that it is 1,000 times closer to capitalism in its social type, its social inclinations, interests, and instincts than it is to socialism. The most striking example of how this policy worked out was the role played by Russia and its henchmen in the Spanish Revolution and the Spanish Civil War. It is playing the same role today in the revolutionary situation in France and Italy, and may, we shall soon see why the word, quote, may, is used, following the same role tomorrow in the revolutionary situation in Germany. Second part. Where the Stalinists do dominate the mass movement, and where the world bourgeoisie is not in a very good position to prevent an overturn of capitalism by the bureaucracy, and where geographical conditions facilitate not only such an overthrow, but also physical control by the Kremlin and its police. In such countries, the bureaucracy tolerates neither the rule nor the existence of the capitalist class, Democrats and fascists included. Such countries, under such conditions, it seeks to annex and subjugate. The well-known examples are the 3 Baltic countries, Bessarabia, etc. It will be remembered that they were seized, and unlike Spain, capitalist property in them was wiped out at a favorable moment, that is, when neither the Axis nor the Allies could do anything to prevent it. Once this is understood, the heart of the enigma has been reached. The mystery is unveiled. Then, retracing our steps to the differences between Russia and her capitalist allies, we can see that they all pertain not so much to the, quote, conduct of the war, end quote, as to the post-war period, or more specifically, to the repartitioning of the world after the war, to the division of the spoils. This applies as much to the difference over the, quote, second front as to the others. Russia's imperialist program for the post-war world is not too difficult to ascertain. To describe it is to see how reactionary it is in every respect. In Eastern Europe, the annexation of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, southern Finland, and western Ukraine, and White Russia, Bessarabia, and Bukovina is openly demanded and declared to be beyond debate. But these annexations are not the limit. Always remembering the indispensable prerequisite of a favorable relationship of forces, Russia aims at having, as a minimum, vassal governments in Poland proper, in Finland, in Bulgaria, and if not in all of Yugoslavia, then at least in Serbia. As a maximum, the complete occupation, domination, and annexation of all these countries, including the expropriation of the native capitalist class, as well as, remember, the working class and peasantry, and the seizure of all property by the bureaucracy. Success in such an audacious program means also, as the map will immediately show, the finish of Romania as well. In the Near East, as a minimum, quote, free passage through the Dardanelles and down to the Persian Gulf. As a maximum, return of the territory lost to Turkey through the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, the Kars region, the occupation of bases on the Dardanelles and Bosphorus, and either a protectorate over or occupation of Iran, in whole or in part. The Russian demands on Turkey were revealed to Hitler and von Ribbentrop, according to these gentlemen, in the famous meeting they had with Molotov just before June 22, 1941. There is no particular reason, in the given case, for granting greater credence to Molotov's subsequent denials than to Hitler's and Ribbentrop's asseverations. In Asia, a minimum of the northwestern province of China, including most of Xinjiang, Shenxi, Shuiwan, I don't even know if I'm saying these right, Kansu, Qinghai, Ningxia, and Xinjiang, with a population over 20 million, a maximum, provided there is a collapse and defeat of Japan, of most or all of Manchuria. Is the realization of so breathtaking a program guaranteed? Let's underscore right here that we believe no such thing. Is it the program of the Stalinist bureaucracy? This we most decidedly believe. Is its realization possible? Yes, entirely possible in our opinion, provided the Kremlin finds the circumstances favorable for it. The circumstances are of two kinds. 1. The weakness of the revolutionary socialist and nationalist movements. 2. Inability, for any reason, of Russia's allies to stop her expansion. What indications are there that this is the Stalinist program and that steps have been taken in the direction of realizing it? 1. Stalin has successfully maneuvered a break with the Polish, quote, government in exile in London. In Moscow, Stalin has set up a completely servile Polish National Committee with a full-sized apparatus, including a radio station, and, what is more important, a now highly trained, highly mechanized Stalinist division of Poles. The Kosciuszko division, or the Kosciuszko division. Come on. The first Tadeusz, I don't know how to say that, Kosciuszko Infantry Division was an infantry division in the Polish Armed Forces formed in 1943 and named for the Polish and American revolutionary Tadeusz Kosciuszko. Formed in the Soviet Union, it was the first division of the First Army and of what later became the post-war Polish Armed Forces after the invasion of Poland in 1939 and defeating Nazi Germany in 1945. It was considered part of Polish Armed Forces in the East. Back to the text. How successful the agitation and organization work carried on among Polish prisoners and deportees in Russia has been, we do not know. But undoubtedly, it has been intensive. Stalin can appear in Poland tomorrow with a well-integrated force, not only Polish, but backed by the vast apparatus, to say nothing of the, quote, Red Army of the Kremlin. How much resistance will the, quote, government in exile be able to offer? In any case, much more will be offered by the rank-and-file revolutionary underground movement. Just how much remains to be seen. 2. Finland seems to be just about at the end of her rope. The fact that Stalin has remained ice-cold and silent to the recent all-but-public appeal by the Finns for a, quote, decent peace is significant. Stalin is in no mood for a, quote, decent peace with the Finns. If the military situation continues to improve for him, tomorrow will find the Kremlin even more peremptory and exigent in its demands on Finland. For Germany, it does not ask, quote, unconditional surrender, end quote. For Finland, it may very well ask just that. Meanwhile, somewhere in the Kremlin files lies the easily dusted off Finnish People's Government of O.W. Kuusinen. 3. In Yugoslavia, from all reports, the Stalinists have been steadily gaining strength at the expense of the greater Serbian imperialist force of Mikhailovich. The, quote, partisans do not seem to be a Stalinist army, but the fact of Stalinist control, or at the very least, Stalinist decisive influence, in it seems to be well established. In one respect, the situation is more favorable in Yugoslavia for the Stalinists than in Poland. In the former country, they have a substantial armed force right on the spot, with the only other armed native claimant for power, Mikhailovich, increasingly discredited, even though by no means a negligible force for that. 4. In Bulgaria, in spite of the savage persecutions to which it has been subjected for more than 20 years, the Communist Party, whose strength is difficult to judge, nevertheless seems to be the only organized force among the masses, apart from the army, among the population in general, and even in higher circles, including the military. A pro-Russian orientation has not only been maintained, but, it seems, strengthened. Bulgaria is not yet officially at war with Russia and very likely will not be. A collapse in that country, originating there or following a general European collapse, would undoubtedly create conditions favorable to Stalinist control or, at least, to decisive Russian political influence. 5. In Iran, something like half the country is already occupied by Russian troops, and the Iranian government, and the, quote, Iranian government, end quote, is just about as independent as the Slovakian government of Father Tiso. Although the other half is formally occupied by the British, there are indications that it is American influence and control that are growing in the country. Oil has an attractive smell. Nevertheless, Stalin is there and is fairly well entrenched. It's hard to believe that, quote, after the emergency is over, end quote, the Russian troops and commissars will simply walk out of the country of their own accord and with a brief, quote, goodbye and thank you. 6. The Stalinists, Russian, not Chinese, have been dominant in Xinjiang for several years now. Russian, quote, advisors, who are to be found everywhere in this Chinese province, pretty much dictate all policy. Not only has the provincial army been built and trained by Russian officers and equipped with Russian armaments, but Russia has long maintained garrisons of her own troops in a number of strategic Xinjiang cities. Freedom of speech is generally allowed if you say nothing anti-Russian. How closely controlled Xinjiang's political life is may be judged from the fact that the, quote, purges in Russia are paralleled in the province. When the GPU head, Yagoda, was shot in Moscow, his man, head of the Bureau of Public Safety in Tihua, Xinjiang's capital, was shot immediately afterward. You can get into Xinjiang only with the approval of Moscow or the Russian diplomatic agent in Lanchov. And if any foreigner has succeeded in entering in the last few years, the fact is certainly not widely known. The whole of northwest China could be dominated without too much difficulty from a series of very well-equipped Russian air bases, centering in Alma-Ata, where Trotsky was once exiled, which is just inside the Russian border from Xinjiang and directly related to the large air bases built by the Russians and Chinese aid at Lanchao, Ansi, Hami, Tihua, and Ili, and largely manned by the Russians. It's hardly necessary to mention the independent and powerful Stalinist Eighth Route Army. Wikipedia says the Eighth Route Army Officially known as the 18th Group Army of the National Revolutionary Army of the Republic of China, was a group army under the command of the Chinese Communist Party, nominally within the structure of the Chinese military, headed by the Chinese Nationalist Party during the Second Sino-Japanese War. The 8th Route Army was created from the Chinese Red Army on September 22, 1937, when the Chinese Communists and Chinese Nationalists formed the Second United Front against Japan at the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War, as the Chinese theater was known in World War II. Together with the new 4th Army, the 8th Route Army formed the main communist fighting force during the war and was commanded by Communist Party leader Mao Zedong and General Zhu Dai. Though officially designated the 18th Group Army by the Nationalists, the unit was referred to by the Chinese Communists and Japanese military as the 8th Route Army. The 8th Route Army wore nationalist uniforms and flew the flag of the Republic of China and waged mostly guerrilla war against the Japanese, collaborationist forces, and later in the war other nationalist forces. The unit was renamed the People's Liberation Army in 1947 after the end of World War II, as the Chinese Communists and Nationalists resumed the Chinese Civil War. Back to the text. It is hardly necessary to mention the independent and powerful Stalinist 8th Route Army, which dominates Yan'an with reputedly 100,000 regulars and many times that number of cooperating partisans. For all its transformations and avowals of loyalty, it has remained what it was, an arm of the Stalinist regime, successfully exploiting the peasant discontent and therefore a permanent thorn in the side of the Chinese bourgeoisie. It is noteworthy that just recently the Russian Stalinist press made a special point of its critical attitude toward the Chongqing regime of Chiang and his circle, as if to go out of its way to emphasize that in China too, Russia is intent on playing an independent role, by no means confined to altruistic gifts of aid and best wishes to the Chongqing government. Even if all this is granted, it does not yet take up the question that has arisen recently to the top of people's thoughts, namely, what are Russia's intentions toward Germany? No matter how much importance is attached to such countries as Russia's border states, they are not of world-deciding significance. A country like Germany is. Germany is the key to Europe. Will Russia be the key to Germany? Does Stalin aim to, quote, communize Germany, as the bourgeois press would say? Can he? Or does he merely want a good, strong, friendly, democratic neighbor in Germany? Just what is the meaning of the mystery-creating, quote, Free German National Committee set up in Moscow? Are Russian differences with the Allies over the question of Germany's post-war fate irreconcilable? If not, along what lines may they be reconciled? What role may the German workers be expected to play in all this? Obviously, these are vital questions. For Europe, they are becoming the vital questions, because at bottom, Germany remains what Germany always was, the key to the European, and therefore to the world situation, but to pursue our analysis along this line requires another article. The end. Thanks for listening.